She didn't know much about her grandfather, just a few stories and whispered memories. 30 years had passed since he died, his possessions packed up into boxes and stuffed under the stairs. But she had reached the age when she wanted to know more about her past, and so she decided to pull out those long-buried boxes and go through their contents. Each object was fascinating. Where had it come from? What did it mean to her grandfather? One item in particular caught her eye, an old leather-bound diary. She wondered if it was worth anything. When she asked her dad about it, he just shrugged. He said they had gone through his father's possessions when he died, but none of them seemed to have any significant value. But he didn't want to part with the memories, so he put them in storage. The next day, she took the diary to an antique dealer. She wasn't expecting much, but when the dealer opened the box, he gave a little gasp. He carefully lifted the diary out of the box and opened it up and looked through the pages, and then he began to tell her an intriguing story. This was not a diary. It was a famous whaling captain's journal from 1823. Unlike the ship's log, which listed the technical details of the voyage, the captain's journal contained his personal story. And then came the news she did not expect. This little diary had sat unnoticed for decades. It was worth somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. She couldn't help but gasp herself when she heard the figure. She had no idea she had been left such a valuable inheritance. Isn't the same true of us? How often do we really think about the incredible inheritance we have been given as God's children? For this is the promise we have. We are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. When we think of the word inheritance, the idea of a gift immediately comes to mind. Typically, an inheritance takes the form of people providing instructions in a will or other document on how they want their earthly possessions distributed after their death. Sometimes an inheritance is small, just a trinket or keepsake that has little worth except the sentimental value the receiver has attached to it. Or sometimes the inheritance is large, like the sizable money, property, and titles the next English monarch is in line to possess. But let's talk about your inheritance for a minute, for indeed you've been promised one. And I'm happy to tell you it is huge, for your Father is rich. Just read what the Bible has to say about him. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, the majesty. Everything in the heavens and on earth is yours, O Lord. And this is your kingdom. We adore you as the one who is over all things. That's right. Glistening in the jewel box of God's promise to you is a guarantee of your inheritance. You are an heir of God, and co-heir with Christ. You aren't simply a slave or a servant or even a saint of God, as great as that would be. No, you are a child of God, and you have legal right to the family business and fortune of heaven. The will has been executed, the courts have been satisfied, your spiritual account has been funded. You will never exhaust your Father's resources. At no time will he wave away your prayers or say he can't provide for you. No, he is affluent, wealthy in love, abundant in hope, and overflowing in wisdom. You have an abundance of supernatural resources. But do you believe this? Or do you find yourself thinking that you're out of solutions, that there is no way the problem in front of you will ever be resolved, that there is no way the plan you want to put into motion will ever get off the ground? There's a story in the Bible about a man who could have felt this way. Many years before, his people, the Hebrews, had been delivered from Egyptian captivity, and God had led them under the leadership of a man named Moses to the edge of a land he had promised to them. He had told Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites." God did not tell them to conquer, to take, to invade, subject, or secure the land. He told them he was giving it to them. All they had to do was take it, but they didn't. It was a bad decision with a 40-year probation penalty. God left them to wander in the wilderness for a generation until a new breed of followers surfaced. Joshua was the leader of that generation, and he had to wander in the desert with the rest of his people. But then came the time for them to take the land, to once again grab hold of the promise of Canaan, to finally have a place to call home. And then Moses died. Had Joshua given in to discouragement, who would have blamed him? There was no one like Moses. He had confronted Pharaoh when the Hebrew people were enslaved. He had led the people through the middle of the Red Sea. And when the ex-slaves were hungry, thirsty, or confused, Moses intervened, and God provided food and water and the 10 Commandments. Moses meant more to the Hebrews than Queen Victoria, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great meant to their people. If Moses' face were carved into Mount Sinai, the Hebrews would never let another share the honor with him. To lose Moses was to lose the cause, and they lost him. And yet, with the grass yet to grow over Moses' grave, God told Joshua, "Moses is dead. Now therefore arise." Already we get hints of a major theme in Joshua. God's power alters the score. Moses may be dead, but God is alive. And God wanted Joshua to claim the promise that he had given to his people so many years before. The word inheritance is to Joshua's book what delis are to Manhattan. Everywhere. The word appears nearly 60 times. The command to possess the land is seen 5 times. Yet while we typically think of Joshua as taking the land, it's more precise to think of him as taking God at his word. He took the land for sure, but he did so because he trusted God's promise. The great accomplishment of the Hebrew people was this: they lived out of their inheritance. This is not to say the Hebrew people didn't face challenges. The Jordan River was wide, the Jericho walls were high, the evil inhabitants of Canaan were not giving up without a fight. Still, Joshua crossed the Jordan, brought down the walls of Jericho, and defeated the 30 enemy kings. Every time he faced a challenge, he did so with faith because he trusted his inheritance. What if you did the same? What if you decided to take God at his word and claim your inheritance? As we've said, you have one. If you have given your heart to Christ, God has given a promised land to you. As Paul states, God has blessed you in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. Note the tense. He has blessed, not he will bless, might bless, or someday could possibly bless. No, the property has been placed in your name. The courthouse records in heaven have been changed. God has already given you Canaan. You already have everything you need to be everything God desires. You have access to every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. So, what is keeping you from seeing that inheritance? Perhaps standing before you is a Jericho-sized wall of fear, brick upon brick of anxiety and dread, a stronghold of oppression. Your circumstance says cower to your fears, but your inheritance says otherwise. God says, you are my child, and my perfect love casts out fear. Move forward. Perhaps haunting you are the kings of confusion. Thanks to them, you struggled with your identity and your destiny, and they want you to believe that life has no purpose. But then you remember your inheritance, truth, guidance from God, His word to instruct you. And so you fight on like Joshua did for 7 years. In the end, you experience more victory than defeat. In Romans chapter 8, verses 15 through 17, the Apostle Paul says, this resurrection life you received from God is not a timid, grave-tending life. It's adventurously expectant, greeting God with a childlike, "What's next, Papa?" God's Spirit touches our spirits and confirms who we really are. We know who He is, and we know who we are, Father and children, and we know we are going to get what's coming to us, an unbelievable inheritance. The cronies of dismay, gloom, and dejection have no answer to this promise of inheritance. Divine resources have been deposited in your heart. You have everything you need to be everything God desires. Need more patience? It's yours. Need more joy? Ask for it. Running low on wisdom? Well, God has plenty, but in your order. Understand your place in the family. You come to God not as a stranger, but as an heir to the promise. You approach God's throne not as an interloper, but as a child in whom the Spirit of God dwells. And your inheritance is every bit as abundant as that of Jesus himself. What he receives, you receive. As John wrote, in this world, we are like Christ. That's right. You share in the same inheritance as Christ. Your portion isn't a pittance. You don't inherit leftovers. You don't wear hand-me-downs. You aren't left out in the cold with the distant cousins. Your portion is Jesus's portion. Whatever he has, you have. Just think of what this promise means. Jesus cashed checks out of a boundless account. Grudges didn't corrode him. Despair didn't control him. Mood swings couldn't touch his joy. His conviction was bulletproof. He was the Fort Knox of faith. And when we give our hearts to him, he hands us the checkbook. No wonder the Apostle Paul wrote, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him." Your imagination is far too timid to understand God's dream for you. He stands with you on the eastern side of the Jordan River and gestures at the expanse of Canaan and says to you what he said to Joshua, "Be strong and of good courage, for this is your inheritance." Perhaps you haven't been living as an heir of God because you don't recognize that you already have this inheritance. Well, now you do. Now you know that you have an unshakable promise from God, that you are made for more than the wilderness. Now you know that God has set you free so he can raise you up. The unshakable promise has been given. Why don't you trust it?